I call Scott Simpson.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And notwithstanding the concluding comments of the Honourable David Parker in his speech, I'd like to acknowledge, as Chair of the Select Committee, the assistance and work that he, as Labor lead, did on the Select Committee, because I think that actually much of his contribution at Select Committee was extremely useful, and as a result we have indeed produced at third reading a bill that is in better shape than it was when it was first introduced. Because we have made a couple of refinements, a number of points that I think have been well received by firstly the Select Committee but across the House. So this bill, as amended and back to the House for third reading, is not without its detractors, but actually it's a piece of legislation that needs to be updated, to be modernised and to be brought into a regime that is more practical and more effective than the original legislation when it was introduced all those years ago. Now, sir, in summary, the real issues that we had to address as a committee and that this House really has to address is that since the introduction of the original principal legislation, child drownings in residential swimming pools have actually decreased from 100 in the 10 years before the legislation was introduced to 21 in the 10 years since to 2014. Now that's all very good news and encouraging news, particularly for the parents and young children who swim in pools. But there are absolutely some aspects of that original legislation that created inconsistencies and that were cumbersome in terms of administration and in terms of application. And so what this bill seeks to do is to tidy up some of those aspects and to bring about, I think, a more useful but still important child safety regime to ensure that drownings are kept to the absolute minimum. The original legislation actually created a number of challenges for people who were both owners and operators of swimming pools and small hot tubs and spas and that sort of pool, and also it created challenges for those that had to inspect and maintain the legislative regime that the bill set up. What we've acknowledged is that in the spa pool sector particularly, the industry norm in relation to safety covers is that they exist, and spa pools actually create and impose a relatively small risk of drowning, particularly to young children, yet the Swimming and the Fencing of Swimming Pools Act required them all to be fenced. Now, what we've done in this bill, sir, is make some, I think, some sensible changes, and that's been addressed by other speakers, including the Minister, who I thought gave a very thorough and good analysis of the bill's progress through the House, what its genesis was, why it needed to be introduced, what it hopes to achieve, and what it will seek to do. But perhaps one of the most important changes that we made at Select Committee when we were considering this bill, sir, was that around the monitoring and inspection of pools by local authorities. And so we were originally contemplating a 5-year inspection regime. We had a number of submitters, very good submitters, who made a point that 3 yearly was probably more appropriate. And on the basis of those submissions and the sound logical arguments that were put forward to us, we have decided to change that to require a 3 yearly inspection across the country, because it became obvious to us, sir, that there were some local body jurisdictions that were inspecting every 3 years, some were 5 years, indeed some were not inspecting at all, and that simply wasn't a tolerable position to be in. So there were a number of changes made in that regard. Another area that has been changed is the ability for those inspections, where councils don't wish to undertake that work themselves, there will be an opportunity for them, should they wish, to contract out that work to suitably qualified and approved inspectors, organisations and individuals who have had approval from MB to do that work. And I think that that will create some flexibility for maybe small local territorial authorities who are not wishing to partake of that kind of inspection work. The larger territorial authorities probably have some very good systems and structures in place to achieve that, but we wanted to ensure that the element of choice was available not only to the inspecting authorities, but ultimately also to the pool and spa owners. Sir, this piece of legislation is a good piece of legislation. It's been well thought through by the Select Committee. I commend it to the House. I think it's a very good piece of legislation. I think that it's a piece of legislation that will stand the test of time. I thank the Minister for his attention to detail, for his willingness to take...
Sorry to interrupt the honourable member. The time has come to leave the chair. Members, this debate is interrupted and set down for resumption next sitting day, and the House stands adjourned until 2 p.m. tomorrow. Good evening.